A man who spent his life alone in the mountains never expected the snow to give him something worth living for. Cole Turner was 41 years old, a mountain man living far from the nearest town, trapping and hunting alone through every season. One bitter evening on a frozen ridge, he noticed movement beneath the snow where there should have been nothing. He dropped to his knees and dug with his bare hands until he pulled a free young woman, barely alive, her fingers curled tight, her lips pale as winter sky. Her name was Abigail Reed. He carried her home through the blizzard and spent the long night warming her by the fire. When she finally opened her eyes, she told him she had no home left to return to. By morning, Cole asked her to stay. What would make a woman rescued from death say yes before the sun even rose? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mornings on that mountain had a particular quality that no other place on earth could quite match. The light came in sideways through the pines, pale and slow, as though it had no real intention of arriving, but showed up anyway out of long habit. The snow on the upper ridges caught the first of it and held it a while, glowing faintly before the rest of the world woke. Cole Turner had watched that light come in across those ridges for going on 20 years, and it still stopped him, just for a moment, every single time. He was not a man who spoke often about beauty or bothered to catalog the things that moved him. But that morning light, arriving without fail through all of winter's long effort to stop everything, was the closest thing to devotion that his daily life contained. His cabin sat in a clearing on the eastern slope, sheltered from the worst of the north wind by a long arm of granite that curved around behind it like the back of a sleeping animal. He had built the cabin himself, log by log, over a single summer when he was 23 years old, and still possessed of the particular energy that makes a young man believe he can solve any problem by working harder at it. He had been right about that, in this instance. The walls were thick and fitted well, the chinking he had done and redone over the years, until not a breath of outside air could find its way through without his permission. The roof had been replaced twice. The first time after a heavy spring snow load buckled the center beam, the second time as a matter of preventive maintenance rather than necessity. The floor was packed earth-covered with boards he had split and planed himself from a fallen tamarack, each one fitted edge to edge as precisely as he could manage with the tools available to him. The door frame was square and true, fitted with a bar he had forged at a smithy in Hatcher's Creek during the first winter after he built the place, iron thick enough to mean something if it needed to. It was not a grand place by any measure that a town person would apply, but it was solid and it was his, and every nail and notch in it carried the memory of the day he had placed it there. Cole's days followed a rhythm as reliable as the seasons that governed them. He was out of bed before first light, the fire built up from its overnight coals, coffee boiling in the same battered tin pot he had carried across 3 mountain ranges over 15 years. He ate simply, dried meat and hardtack in winter, whatever the land offered fresh when the seasons permitted, pan bread when flour was available and he had the inclination. He checked his trap lines on foot in the mornings, moving through the timber with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has learned that the wilderness rewards attention above speed, and that rushing produces mostly mistakes. He knew every draw and hollow on his portion of the mountain, knew where the marten ran and where the beaver dammed the creek each autumn, knew which way the elk moved when the temperature dropped below a certain threshold and the higher meadows froze hard and the animals had to descend for open water. He had paid for this knowledge over 20 years of careful observation, and he valued it accordingly. In the afternoons, he worked around the cabin, splitting and stacking the firewood that the long winters consumed in quantities that would have seemed improbable to anyone who had not wintered at elevation, repairing gear, curing hides, mending the accumulating small things that a working life always produces. He was competent at all of it and excelled at most. The pelts he brought to the trading post in Hatcher's Creek twice a year were consistently graded high, the cuts clean and the curing thorough, and the trader there had suggested more than once that he could do considerably better if he brought them more often, or brought on a partner to work the lower lines while he worked the upper. Cole had thanked the man each time, continued to come twice a year, and to work alone. He did not need considerably better. He needed enough. Enough was a thing he had always been capable of, producing what was available to him, and there was a particular satisfaction in that self-sufficiency that he did not expect many people to understand. He did not miss the conveniences of town life. He had sampled it twice, briefly, once in his mid-20s, when a woman in a settlement called Deering had seemed worth staying for, and once in his early 30s, when a broken leg had confined him to a boarding house for 11 weeks in Hatcher's Creek. Both times the walls had closed in well before he was ready to leave. The noise of town life, the perpetual proximity of strangers, the way people in settled places always seemed to be performing for each other in a manner he could not precisely name, but that cost him something to observe for extended periods. He did not judge them for needing that kind of proximity. He understood that most people required community, the way they required warmth and regular meals. It simply was not the life his particular nature was suited for, and he had understood this clearly enough and early enough that it had never been a source of grief. It was simply the truth of what he was, and he had built accordingly. He had grown up on a homestead in Missouri, the second of 4 children born to Jonas and Margaret Turner. His father was a capable man with his hands, and a hard, unyielding quality in his convictions. Jonas Turner believed he was right with the thoroughness of a man who has never been given adequate cause to doubt himself, and he extended that certainty into every matter the household encountered, including the question of his son's futures. Cole had loved his father in the complicated way of sons who admire difficult men, with a mixture of genuine respect and persistent frustration, and the particular quiet grief that comes from wanting more closeness than a person is constitutionally capable of offering. The argument over the homestead arrived when Cole was 19, old enough to see the problem and young enough to say so with more heat than patience. Jonas had 3 sons and intended to divide the land 3 ways when the time came. Cole, the eldest of the boys, believed the land could not sustain 3 separate households, and that keeping it whole under one management was the only arrangement that made sound practical sense. He had said so plainly one November evening at the kitchen table, with the rest of the family in bed and the fire burning low between them. Jonas had told him equally plainly that the decision was not his to make. They had looked at each other across the table for a long, still moment, and Cole had understood in that silence that no amount of time of further argument would alter the fundamental nature of the disagreement. He had left within the week. He carried no bitterness about it anymore. The years had worn the sharp edges off that old wound the way water wears stone, gradually and without drama. He thought about his mother more than his father. He remembered Margaret Turner's hands, capable and unhurried, and the particular way she had of being quietly competent about everything she undertook, as though the constant demanding labor of keeping a household and 4 children whole was simply the ordinary business of a day. She had given him the Bible before he left, pressing it into his hands on the porch without ceremony, and told him that wherever he ended up, God would know where to find him. He had kept that Bible ever since. It lived on his shelf now between a worn almanac and a handwritten guide to the mountain plants he had building from observation for the better part of 2 decades.
His nearest neighbor, if the word could be stretched to cover a half-day's ride through heavy timber and across the lower creek, was a man named Silas Dunbar, who had come west in his youth to trap and had never found a sufficient reason to return. Silas was 68 years old, lean and weathered as old saddle leather, with a white beard he kept trimmed close, and a dry, spare economy of speech that concealed a considerable warmth if you were patient enough to get past the surface. He and Cole had first met over a disputed trapline 12 years earlier, a meeting that could easily have become a lasting enmity, and instead produced a friendship built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that honesty between working men was not merely a virtue, but a practical necessity. Silas came by twice a season, in early autumn and again before the deep winter sealed the passes, bringing trade goods and word from Hatcher's Creek and occupying the cabin's second chair for an evening before heading back down. Cole looked forward to these visits more than he would have readily admitted. Silas was the best kind of company, which meant he did not waste words, did not perform, and could occupy a shared silence without feeling the need to fill it. When he said something, it was worth the listening. When he found something worth laughing at, the laugh was genuine and complete and unhurried. The November that changed everything had begun like every November before it. The first hard snow came in the second week of the month, a foot of it overnight, settling on the mountain with the quiet finality of something that has made up its mind. Cole spent 3 days clearing the roof and breaking trail to his nearest lines, working in the cold with a methodical patience that distinguishes experienced winter labor from the frantic kind. The deep cold settled in behind the snow and stayed, the dry, still cold that glazes every surface and makes the air sharp enough to feel in the back of the throat. He welcomed it. Deep cold meant good trapping, and it meant the mountain was becoming what it became in winter, sealed off from the ordinary world below, reduced to essentials, entirely and unapologetically itself. He noticed the wagon tracks on the third day of clearing, working a trap line along the lower edge of the timber above the main ridge trail. The trail through that section was used occasionally by settlers and supply wagons before winter closed it, and most years the last wagon came through in October. These tracks were fresh, the horses driven at a pace that was urgent and somewhat careless for the road conditions. The wheel ruts pressed deep. He crouched beside the trail and studied the tracks. The stride length of the horses, the slight skid at the curve where the driver had come around too fast, 2 sets of boot prints stepping out briefly in one section, and then only one set returning to the wagon. He noted all of this with the patient attention he brought to everything the mountain offered him to read. He thought nothing more of it and went back to his work. His evenings were the texture of a life so fully settled into itself that it had stopped requiring examination. He cooked and ate without hurry, cleaned his gear, read by firelight from one of the 3 books on his shelf, and lay in his bunk in the dark and listened to the mountain speak in the language it knew. Wind through the pines, ice cracking on the creek below, the deep and ancient silence between those sounds. He was not given to sentiment or to habitual self-examination, but on those long winter nights, the thinking came anyway, quiet and unannounced. He thought about his mother sometimes, and his brothers, and the Missouri homestead he had not laid eyes on in more than 15 years. He thought occasionally about the woman in Deering, wished her well in the uncomplicated way of a man who has no regrets, but who remembers kindness when he encounters it. He did not often think about what was missing, because he had arranged things so carefully that nothing seemed to be missing. The mountain provided what it provided. He had built the rest himself, carefully, and without hurry, over 20 years. It was a sufficient life, he believed that. But the night the big storm came in, the night the temperature dropped sharply and the snow drove horizontal across the ridge, and the wind hit the cabin walls with a force that rattled the shutters in their frames. Cole Turner lay in his bunk in the dark and found himself thinking about those wagon tracks, about the speed of them, about the 2 sets of boot prints in one section, and then only one returning to the wagon. A detail that had no clear significance he could name and yet refused to settle and become quiet. He turned over and told himself it was nothing. The storm hit the cabin again, hard enough to speak through the walls. He came awake in the darkness with no reason he could name. That was how it had always worked when the mountain wanted something from him. No sound, no movement, nothing that would register on any ordinary scale. Just an abrupt and total wakefulness, sleep stepping aside without ceremony. Cole had learned over 20 years not to question the instinct. He sat up, swung his legs to the floor, and dressed in the dark with the automatic competence of a man who has performed the same sequence enough times that it requires no light and no thought. Outside, the storm had paused in that uncertain way of mountain blizzards, the wind dropping to a murmur, the snow falling straight and heavy rather than horizontal. His lantern flame barely pushed the darkness back 3 feet. The cold hit him at the door and went through every layer he wore. But he had dressed for cold, and he stepped into it without breaking stride. He moved along the ridge trail, because that was where his feet took him, the lantern swinging, his breath rising in short white clouds, his boots punching through the ice-glazed crust with every step. The pines along the trail were bowed deep under their loads, their branches forming a dark tunnel that the lantern's small light made even darker by contrast. The silence was absolute in the way that silence on a mountain in deep winter is absolute, a quality not of emptiness but of compression, as though the cold had pressed everything into itself. He had gone perhaps half a mile when he stopped. There was a depression in the snow on the downhill side of the trail, just past the curve where the ridge narrowed, and the drop on the right side became serious. It was subtle in the way that things are subtle when nature is trying to conceal something, easily missed by someone walking with a destination in mind. But Cole was not walking with a destination. He was attending. The depression had the shape of something pressed from below, rather than fallen from above, and it moved. Not dramatically, not in any way a person walking purposefully past would notice. Just the faintest possible shift at the surface, the smallest evidence of something still present. He was on his knees before the thought had fully resolved. He set the lantern aside and drove both hands into the snow and began digging with the focused speed of a man in whom deliberation and urgency have joined into a single motion. He pulled the snow away in great armloads, working his way toward the shape he could feel beneath his palms, not pausing to reassess, not hesitating. He found her fingers first. They were curled hard around something small and cold and made of metal, and they were so rigid that for one terrible moment he believed he was too late. Then he felt, or believed he felt, the faintest thread of resistance still present in the muscles, some final stubbornness that had not given up, and he kept digging. It took perhaps 3 minutes to clear enough snow to get his arms properly underneath her. She was not a large woman, but she was dead weight, and the packed snow held onto her with the patient grip of something that has claimed a thing and sees no reason to give it back. He pulled her free in one long committed effort that cost him his footing and put him on his heels in the drift with her lying across his chest. She was entirely limp, her face turned against his coat, and he could not read it clearly in the lantern's light. Her lips, when he brought the light close, were the blue-white of serious frostbite, the waxy pallor that tells a person who knows what to look for that the body has withdrawn its warmth inward to protect the core. Her outer garments were soaked through and frozen stiff as board. Her right hand was still curled around the locket on its chain, and that grip told him she had been conscious, at some point after she fell, that she had reached for something known and familiar, and held on to it in the dark. Her breathing when he pressed his ear to her chest was shallow and irregular but present. He did not stop for another thing. He stripped off his outer coat and wrapped it around her as best he could, lifted her against his chest, and turned back toward the cabin. The half-mile back took the better part of an hour, breaking trail through the drifts with a woman in his arms and the storm beginning to rebuild behind him, the wind picking up, the snow starting to drive. He did not allow himself to think about anything except the next step, and the step after that, and the fire waiting at the end of them. Inside, he worked with the focused calm of a man who has handled emergencies before, and understands that panic is the one luxury he cannot afford. The fire was built up to a roaring heat in minutes. He removed her frozen outer layers as carefully as the stiff material allowed, aware of the frostbite damage in her fingers and the skin of her face, easing rather than pulling. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, positioned her close enough to the fire to benefit from the heat, but not so close as to cause the tissue damage that too rapid rewarming can produce. He had treated frostbite twice on himself and once on a trapper he had found collapsed on the upper ridge years ago. He knew what needed doing, and he did it. He pried her fingers open gently and removed the locket. Not wanting the frozen metal pressing against her skin, he set it on the table and gave it one brief look. A small oval piece of tarnished silver, worn smooth on the face from long handling. The kind of thing a person carries because it holds someone's face. He turned back to her. He did not sleep for the rest of the night. He monitored her breathing, which was his primary concern, and found it steadying slowly over the first 2 hours. He checked her fingers and her feet for the returning color that would indicate blood moving freely again. He fed the fire without interruption and kept the cabin at a heat that was almost uncomfortable for a man in full health, because warmth was the best thing he had to offer, and he intended to give all of it. Near mid-morning, her eyes opened. They moved across the ceiling slowly, the way eyes move when a mind is assembling a world from pieces that have been scattered. And then they found him, where he sat in the chair across the room. She did not flinch. She did not pull away or make a sound of alarm. She looked at him with the exhausted, disbelieving calm of a person who has used up the portion of herself that is capable of surprise somewhere out in that dark and cold. Her first words were barely audible. "Am I still alive?" "You are," Cole said. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, they were clearer. "I fell from the wagon, on the ridge. I found you in the snow about half a mile from here." He brought her broth he had kept warm, helped her hold the cup in her bandaged hands. Small sips, no hurry. She drank with care. Some color was returning to her face. "My name is Abigail Reed, Cole Turner." She took in the cabin around her without haste. The fire, the rough walls, the tools and gear arranged on the pegs. "How long have I been here?" "Since roughly 2 in the morning. It is past 10 now." A pause that lasted the length of a decision already made. Then, quietly, "Did the wagon come back for me?" Cole held her gaze. "There was no wagon on that trail when I found you. No one came here while you were unconscious." She received this without visible reaction. She had already known the answer. She had simply needed someone else to say it plainly, someone with no reason to soften it. He refilled her cup and let the fire fill the silence between them. The locket sat on the table, and her eyes found it and settled there, and something moved across her face that was entirely her own and required nothing from him. The storm outside continued without interest in any of it, laying down its long white silence over the whole mountain. She slept for most of the next 2 days, which was exactly what her body required and exactly what Cole expected. He worked around her presence in the cabin with a careful, unobtrusive competence, maintaining the fire, checking her hands and feet twice daily, leaving food and water within reach whenever she stirred. He had given her the spare bunk in the corner, a simple frame he had built years ago from pine boards, intended for the occasional passing trapper who needed a night's shelter from the weather. He had used it perhaps 6 times in 20 years. He had never particularly thought about the fact that he had built it at all. But now, watching Abigail Reed sleep in it with her bandaged hands resting on top of the blankets, he found himself grateful for some instinct he could not account for. She was not fragile, even in those first days of recovery. He could see that clearly. There was a quality of self-possession about her even in sleep, a stillness that did not come from weakness, but from something more settled than that. When she was awake, she moved carefully within her limitations, not fighting the soreness in her hands and feet, not pretending it wasn't there. Simply accounting for it and working around it the way a practical person accounts for the weather. Cole was aware in those first few days that he was occupying his own cabin differently. He moved more quietly than usual. He went outside more often and for longer intervals than strictly necessary, giving her space. He found himself straightening things he would normally have left where they fell, a habit so unfamiliar that he caught himself doing it twice before he understood what was prompting it. On the 3rd day, she was sitting up when he came in from the morning trap line, her back against the cabin wall, watching the fire with a focused attention that suggested she was not simply resting, but thinking. "How does the trapping work?" she asked without preamble, as though they were resuming a conversation already underway. Cole set his pack down and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He was not a man who underestimated questions. Depends on the animal and the season. In November, I'm mostly running marten and beaver lines. Mink along the creek when the ice isn't too thick. Do you do it alone every year? Every year for going on 20. She nodded, filing that away. And you built this cabin yourself? Summer of my 23rd year. Took about 4 months. She looked around at the walls with a kind of quiet appraisal that he recognized as genuine interest rather than polite attention. You built it to last, she said. Didn't see much point in building it otherwise. The mornings passed like that, in short exchanges that added up slowly, the way a creek builds into a river without any single moment you could point to as the change. Abigail was not a woman who talked to fill silence. She let the quiet sit between them naturally, and only spoke when she had something she actually wanted to say. Cole found he could breathe around that quality in her. Her backstory came out in pieces, never rushed, offered in the matter-of-fact way of a person who has made her peace with hard things without pretending they were easy. Her mother, a woman named Ruth, had died of fever in the early weeks of October, leaving Abigail the only one left of the small household they had kept together in a settlement called Greer's Hollow in the Lower Territories. There had been a father, once, but he had been gone since Abigail was 7, and was not spoken of as a loss so much as an absence that had simply always been there. With her mother gone and no remaining family in Greer's Hollow, Abigail had written to her cousin Martha in a settlement 3 weeks' ride south, received a reply that sounded welcoming, and arranged passage on a supply wagon heading in that direction. She had paid what she could and promised the rest on arrival. The wagon master, a man named Harlan Grew, had accepted the arrangement. She said Grew's name once and then moved past it, but something in the way she said it made Cole pay attention. Not fear, exactly. More like the careful neutrality of a person who has learned to keep certain things behind a closed door. He did not press her. There would be time, or there wouldn't. Silas Dunbar arrived on the 5th day, appearing at the cabin door on snowshoes with a pack on his back and the particular unhurried air of a man who has traveled a long distance in cold weather and considered it no great hardship. His eyes, when Cole opened the door, went immediately past Cole to the figure by the fire, and he stopped mid-step. To his credit, he recovered in the space of about 2 seconds. "Well," he said, "I came to check on you. I see you've been keeping yourself occupied." Cole stepped aside to let him in. Silas Dunbar. Abigail Reed. Silas took off his hat and nodded to her with the natural warmth that Cole had always appreciated in the man. "Miss Reed, I trust Cole has been a tolerable host." "More than tolerable," Abigail said. There was a small, careful warmth in her voice that Cole had not heard before. Silas stayed the afternoon, eating and talking and telling Abigail with a frankness that Cole found simultaneously irritating and accurate that Cole was about the most reliable man on the mountain, but that she should not expect him to say so himself. Abigail listened and watched Cole's reaction with quiet amusement. Before he left, Silas drew Cole outside for a moment on the pretext of checking his snowshoes. In the cold and the low afternoon light, the old man looked at Cole with an expression that was at once amused and entirely serious. "The passes might open in 6 weeks if the weather holds," Silas said. "She could get south." "I know," Cole said. Silas studied him for a moment. "Do you want the weather to hold?" Cole looked out at the mountain, at the white ridge line against the pale sky. "I haven't decided yet," he said, which was the most honest thing he had said in some time. Silas made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He strapped on his snowshoes and headed back into the timber, and Cole stood in the doorway watching him go until the trees swallowed him up. Back inside, Abigail was watching the fire again. She did not ask what they had talked about. Cole sat down in his chair and picked up his almanac and did not read a single word of it for the next hour. 3 weeks into her recovery, Abigail Reed could use her hands again. The frostbite had been real but not severe, and the careful tending of those first days had served her well. The skin of her fingertips was still tender, still a shade pinker than normal, but she could close her hands around a cup and hold it without help. And she seized on that small returning capability with the quiet satisfaction that Cole recognized because he felt it himself whenever a piece of his body healed and came back to full use. She began contributing to the cabin's routines in ways that were practical and unannounced. He would come in from the morning trap line to find that the breakfast fire had already been built up and coffee was on. The hides he had left to dry were turned at the correct intervals. The small, accumulating disorder of a working cabin was addressed with a competent hand that did not rearrange things but simply kept them from getting worse. Cole noticed without comment. He accepted it the way he accepted the help of a good working partner, which was to say he registered it and adjusted his own work accordingly. He had not had a working partner in a very long time, and the ease with which he adjusted surprised him somewhat. She asked to come with him one morning to check the closer trap lines. He considered the request, looked at her boots and her hands, assessed the temperature, and said yes. They moved through the timber in the early light in a companionable quiet that felt, to Cole, like something that ought to have been stranger than it was. She walked well in snow, adapting her stride quickly to the terrain without needing instruction. When he stopped to read a track or work a set, she hung back the right distance and watched without hovering. When he explained what he was doing, she listened with the focused attention of someone learning a skill rather than making conversation. On the way back, she taught him something in return, though she did not frame it that way. She pointed out a ridge of ice crystals on the north face of a rock outcropping and told him what it indicated about the overnight temperature drop and where the deer would have moved as a result. She had grown up, she explained, on the edge of a large property in Greer's Hollow, whose owner had permitted her mother to gather wood from the timber, and she had spent much of her childhood in those woods, learning to read them. Cole listened to her read the ridge the way he listened to Silas talk about the old fur routes, with the respect he gave anyone who knew a thing well. That afternoon he was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard her voice from inside, soft and low, a sound so quiet he almost missed it. He set down the axe and listened for a moment. She was humming, just barely, a hymn he recognized from his childhood, one his mother had sung on Sunday mornings in the Missouri kitchen. He picked up the axe and went back to work and did not let himself examine the feeling that came with recognizing that hymn. It was on a quiet evening, shortly after that Abigail found the Bible. Cole had been outside checking the weather and the condition of the woodpile, and when he came back in, she was standing at the shelf with the book open in her hands, not reading it, looking at something inside the front cover. She held it up when he came in, a question in her expression rather than an apology. He sat down. He did not take the Bible from her. My mother gave me that when I left Missouri. Abigail looked at the inscription inside the cover, his mother's handwriting, deliberate and careful the way handwriting was when a person wanted it to last. Margaret, she said, reading the name written there. Margaret Ann Turner. She was a capable woman. He paused. I didn't give her enough credit for that when I was young. You don't when you're young. Abigail sat down across from him and held the Bible in her lap with a naturalness that told him she was comfortable with it, that it was not an unfamiliar object in her hands. Were you close to her? As close as I knew how to be at 19, which wasn't close enough. He looked at the fire for a moment. She died 8 years ago. I heard from my brother by letter. Too late to get back for the burial. Abigail was quiet for a long moment. My mother read to me from hers every night, even when I was old enough that she didn't need to anymore. I think she did it as much for herself as for me by then. She opened to a page that had been marked with a dried stem of some mountain plant, something Cole himself had placed there years ago. What was she like? He talked about his mother for the better part of an hour, which was more than he had talked about her to anyone in 20 years. He talked about the way she managed the household and the 4 children and Jonas Turner's difficult temperament, without ever appearing to manage any of it, the way good management looks like nothing from the outside. He talked about her garden and her bread, and the particular way she had of listening, which was to look at you directly and not at anything else. Abigail listened the same way, The conversation wound its way gradually into faith, the matter-of-fact kind that both of them carried, and they found a common ground in it that was neither surprising nor particularly profound, just solid, the way common ground tends to be. It was the most personal conversation Cole had had in longer than he could accurately recall. The following morning, he found his traps disturbed. 3 sets along the lower line had been triggered, without catching anything, and the snow around them had been worked over carefully, the tracks obscured but not completely. Someone who knew what they were doing had been at those traps. Someone on foot, moving deliberately. Cole stood in the cold timber and studied the sign for a long time. Then he covered his own tracks going out and came home by a different route. That evening, he sat across from Abigail and watched her hands wrapped around her cup, the firelight moving over her face. And he said nothing about what he had found. Not yet. He had nothing certain to offer, and he was not a man who alarmed people with uncertainty. But he sat by the window longer than usual, before he went to sleep, watching the dark tree line and the empty white of the snow beyond it. She looked at him once from her bunk and said quietly, "Cole, do you ever get lonely up here?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I used to think I didn't." She turned her face back toward the ceiling. The fire settled. The mountain was still outside. Neither of them said anything more, and neither of them needed to. He went back to the lower trap line at first light, before Abigail was awake, moving through the timber with the deliberate quiet of a man who does not want to be heard. What he found confirmed what had been sitting at the back of his mind since the previous evening. 3 more sets had been disturbed, and this time the men had been less careful about concealing their passage. 2 sets of adult boot prints, moving with the calm confidence of people who are not concerned about being tracked in return. They had worked his line with knowledge, not like hunters stumbling across it accidentally, but like men who had been told where to look, or who had been watching it long enough to understand its layout. He tracked them back into the timber until the wind-swept ground gave up the sign. Before it disappeared, he found the camp, a fire ring scraped down to bare earth in a half-hearted attempt at concealment, the impression of 2 bedrolls in the snow on the south side of a pine windbreak. 1 night, at minimum, possibly 2. The camp was 12 hours cold. Either they had departed sometime the previous day, or they were still in the area, and neither possibility offered much reassurance. Cole crouched over the dead fire ring for a long while, thinking in the unhurried, methodical way that worked best for him, without forcing the thinking toward any conclusion it was not yet ready to reach. Then he rose and went back to the cabin. He had weighed, briefly, the option of saying nothing. He could build a reasonable case for it. She was still in recovery. Nothing was yet confirmed beyond sign and the snow. There was no value in raising alarm before something solid could be offered alongside it. He rejected those arguments on the walk home because they were all constructed on the same foundation, which was the assumption that Abigail Reed needed to be protected from information that directly and personally concerned her own safety. Everything he had observed in the past weeks told him that assumption was simply and entirely wrong about her. She heard him out without interruption, seated at the table with both hands around her cup, her eyes level and steady on his face. 2 men, she said when he finished. 2 confirmed. There may be more. Looking for me. That is how it reads. She set the cup down with the deliberateness that was its own form of composure, and was quiet in her characteristic way, not the quiet of someone avoiding a thing, but the quiet of someone working through it methodically. Then she told him the fuller truth about Harlan Grew. She had managed him for 11 days on the trail, she said, not with open confrontation, which she understood would have made her position considerably worse, but with the careful, measured resistance of a person who does not concede ground, while also not declaring hostilities. Grew had made clear, in the precise, indirect language of a man who knows how to say something without quite saying it, that her passage debt was not a thing he expected to see repaid in any conventional arrangement. He was patient about it, which in some ways had been more unsettling than open aggression would have been. He was confident, and he had time on his side, and he knew both of those things. On the 12th day, during the storm on the ridge, She had fallen from the wagon. She did not use the word accident. The omission said more than the word would have. Cole sat with this for as long as it needed. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the heat the information warranted, which was not the absence of feeling, but feeling converted into something more useful than heat. Has he pursued someone who left him before? I don't know for certain, but he is not a man who accepts losing something he has decided belongs to him. All right, Cole said. He got up. He spent the afternoon in practical, methodical preparation, moving through each task with the focused steadiness that always helped him think clearly when the situation was serious. He relocated his rifle to the peg beside the door. He checked the bar on the doorframe and found it sound. He walked the perimeter of the clearing in the low afternoon light, reading the approach routes and the sight lines from the tree line with the patient attention of a man who has been reading terrain his entire adult life. He confirmed the location of the mirror used for the Silas signal and made certain it was accessible without delay. The evening continued alongside all of this, with the ordinary warmth of the cabin, the fire and the cooking, and the quiet talk. And the contrast between the external weight of the situation and the internal warmth of the room was something neither of them mentioned, but both of them felt in the way people feel things that are true without needing to be named. After supper, Abigail told him a story from her childhood about a mule of such legendary and comprehensive stubbornness that the entire surrounding settlement had developed strong and competing opinions about the animal over the years. She told it with a dry, careful humor, the kind that comes from having lived with a memory long enough to see all of its angles. And by the time she reached the third strategy, she and two neighboring boys had devised to negotiate with the animal's considerable will, Cole was laughing. A full and genuine and entirely unhurried laugh from somewhere in him that had apparently been waiting for the right occasion for quite some time. She looked at him when he laughed with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Recognition, perhaps, or something warmer and more particular than that. He checked the window before settling for the night. The mountain was dark and completely still, the snow holding its own quiet light against the overcast, the tree line a clean black edge along the ridge. The silence had changed its character. It was no longer the familiar, empty quiet of a life lived entirely alone, a silence he had built carefully around himself and knew in every detail. It was inhabited now, attended to, alive in a way that required something from him. He lay in the dark and thought about the nature of what had arrived in his life without announcement, and found he had no complaint about any of it. He kept the rifle within reach. The supply cache was a buried box 200 yards into the timber east of the cabin, maintained between Cole and Silas for 11 years as a system of exchange and, in more serious circumstances, communication. Its ordinary use was simple and well practiced. The emergency signal system using carved bark pieces was something they had established early in the friendship, during a period when a difficult neighbor on the lower valley had been creating problems for both of them, and they had needed a way to coordinate without being seen to coordinate. They had tested the system twice, used it once for a minor matter, and never in 11 years needed it in earnest. Cole found the bark piece on the same morning he had intended to send the mirror signal to Silas himself. 2 deep notches carved with care, their agreed signal for unknown parties on or near the mountain, intent unclear, use judgment. He saddled his horse and rode to Silas's place, pushing through the drifts at a deliberate pace, and Silas was already at the door when Cole came out of the last stretch of timber, which meant the old man had been watching the approach and had put coffee on when he saw the horse. They sat at Silas's table, and Silas told it plainly, as he always told things. 2 men had appeared at his door 2 days prior, traveling north on the lower trail. They asked if he had seen a young woman in the area, and the description they gave was accurate enough to indicate either direct observation or a thorough briefing from someone who had seen her personally. They said they were family, concerned about her welfare after the accident on the ridge. Silas had told them he was an old man living alone, who had not seen another person in some weeks, which was technically defensible and practically misleading, and he had offered the statement with the expression of a man who has made his peace with that particular kind of honesty. "What was your read on them?" Cole asked. Silas turned his cup deliberately in both hands. "Not family. Family has a quality when it is genuine, a certain looseness in the anxiety, as though the worry is larger than they know what to do with. These men were contained and purposeful. They were not concerned about her welfare. They believed something had been taken from them without permission, and they intended to recover it. They have been camping on my lower ridge for at least 2 nights, Cole said. Silas looked at him steadily. Grew. Has to be. Abigail has told me enough that it fits without any remaining ambiguity. The old man was quiet for a moment, looking at the window and the gray light in the snow-laden pines beyond it. You know what I am going to say to you. Say it anyway. This does not end on the mountain. However, this arrangement was structured between the woman and this man. The only resolution that holds permanently is the kind recorded in an official ledger. Anything short of that, you resolve it up here today, and he comes at it from a different angle next month. Cole sat with that. He was not a man who reached for institutions as a natural first response to any problem. But Silas was right, and he knew it clearly, and the knowing was not complicated. Handling this on the mountain was a temporary answer to a problem that would not stay temporary. He rode back in the late afternoon with the problem clarifying in his mind, the way problems did when he gave them room and stopped trying to force them. That evening he laid it all out for Abigail at the table, everything Silas had reported, with the same plain directness he would have used for any other serious matter. She heard him fully before she responded. They talked it through with the measured, honest quality that had come to characterize their conversations about anything that mattered. No alarm, no performing of distress, no dramatizing the difficulty. Just 2 people examining a serious problem from every angle available to them. She was frightened. He could see it clearly, not in any outward display, but in the gathering quality she took on when things required more of her than ordinary circumstances did. The same composing inward stillness he had first seen when she read Gru's letter. She was managing the fear the same way she managed her healing hands, working within its constraints rather than pretending it was not there. Then she said the thing that stopped him fully. I've been left behind before. I don't intend for it to happen again. He looked at her across the table. He understood that she was speaking about something considerably larger than the ridge and the snow. She was speaking about the pattern that had shaped her life from the time she was 7 years old and her father had walked out of their household without a backward look. Through 11 days on a wagon with a man who had been steadily narrowing her options. Through the night she had spent buried in the snow while the wagon carried on without her. She was drawing a line between what her life had been and what she intended it to be. He took that seriously. He said nothing for a long moment. He gave the statement the weight it deserved, rather than moving quickly past it to something more manageable. Then he spoke about his own life with more honesty than he had managed in years. About what he had hoped for at 19 when he left Missouri, and how the hoping had narrowed gradually over the years, and then quietly stopped. And how he had told himself the stopping was wisdom rather than what it actually was. Abigail listened the way she always listened, entirely present, not waiting for her turn. In the days after that conversation, Cole made small changes to the cabin that he understood without examining too directly. The cracked second chair, leaning against the wall for 2 years, he repaired one afternoon and placed at the table. He cleared space on the shelf beside his books. His count of the winter stores became a count of 2 people rather than 1. He was making room. The room was for her. He simply had not yet found the right moment to say what the room was for and what it meant. One night well past midnight, standing at the window with the moon laying its blue-white light across the mountain, he made the private decision that had been forming since the night he pulled her from the snow. It required no ceremony. The mountain already knew. She would know soon enough. He found the letter wedged in the gap between the door and its frame, above the latch, before dawn. It had not been there at midnight when he last walked the perimeter. Someone had placed it in the early hours of the morning, moving through the snow without leaving tracks the overnight wind had not already smoothed over. Cole stood in the open doorway for a long moment, looking out at the empty white of the clearing, at the absolute stillness of the tree line, at the mountain offering nothing. Then he brought the letter inside and set it on the table. It was addressed to Abigail Reed in a heavy, deliberate hand, each letter formed with the extra care of someone who wants their writing to communicate authority. The wax seal on the back was dark red, pressed with an impression Cole did not recognize. He built the fire up and set the coffee on and waited for her to wake. The letter was hers to read first. He would not open it. She saw it the moment she sat up. She looked at it steadily, then at Cole, then back at the envelope. She rose and came to the table and stood over it for a moment, before she broke the seal and read it standing, in the firelight, without sitting down. Cole watched her face. He had learned in the weeks of living alongside her to read the quality of her silences and her stillnesses. When she was simply thinking, she was still in one way. When something important and unwelcome arrived, she went still in another, a composing quality, the self gathering itself before the weight of a thing could find its way through. That second stillness was what he saw now. She put the letter face up on the table and sat down. Cole picked it up and read it. Harlan Grew wrote with the practiced fluency of a man who has used the written word as a tool of pressure before and understands precisely what it can accomplish with people who have difficulty refusing a formal document. The first paragraph expressed his relief and concern, language so carefully neutral that its dishonesty sat plainly on the surface, for anyone looking for it. The second paragraph was where the document revealed its actual purpose. It referenced, in specific and businesslike terms, a signed labor contract entered into on Abigail's behalf by her mother, Ruth Reed, approximately 8 months prior to their departure from Greer's Hollow. The terms of the contract, as Grew described them, exchanged 2 years of Abigail's domestic service for passage south, resettlement assistance, and a sum paid directly to her mother at the time of signing. The contract had been witnessed by a notary, Grew noted, and was fully enforceable under the territorial labor statutes applicable to the region. The third paragraph expressed his expectation that Abigail would return at the earliest opportunity, and his willingness to consider her unauthorized departure a misunderstanding rather than a breach of contract, provided she returned willingly. Cole read it twice. He set it face down on the table. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the mountain held its patient and enormous silence. "Did you know about this contract?" Cole asked, nothing in his voice except the question. Abigail's hands were flat on the table in front of her. "My mother told me the cost of my passage was arranged and settled. When I asked how, she said she had made an agreement with Mr. Grew, and I was not to concern myself with the details. She was very ill by then. She needed me to stop worrying about practical matters, and I let her believe I had." A dying woman arranging her daughter's passage was misled about what she was signing by a man who knew she was too ill to read it carefully. Cole said it plainly, without offering it as comfort. "That is not a failure of your judgment." Second question, "Do you want to return to him?" "No." He nodded once. "Cole," she looked at him directly, with the full and steady attention she brought to the things that mattered most to her. "Whatever my mother signed, she did not have the authority to contract my labor for 2 years without my knowledge or agreement. I was 17 at the time of signing, which is not an adult under any law I'm aware of. And the terms as she described them to me bear no resemblance to what is written in that letter. He told her something different from what he put in the document. He knew what he was doing." "I believe you," Cole said. He said it without qualification, without the slight pause that would have made it sound like reassurance rather than fact. He was not offering reassurance. He was simply stating something he knew to be true. He sent the mirror signal to Silas that afternoon. Silas arrived the following morning before noon, having made good time through conditions that would have given most men pause, and sat down at the table with the letter between them, and read it with the care of a man who has been involved in enough frontier disputes to know which details carry weight. He read it twice, set it down, and was quiet in the way of a person who is thinking before speaking, rather than hesitating. I know Gru's name in Hatcher's Creek, not as a criminal, as a businessman with carefully maintained connections. He has done trade with the Territorial Surveyor's Office, and his clerk has had dealings with Judge Hale's clerk, which is not the same as controlling the judge, but which means a formal challenge would face some complications that a straightforward case would not. But Hale himself, Cole said. Silas considered this. Orrin Hale is a fair and thoroughly deliberate man. I have stood before him twice in property disputes over the years and found him to be genuinely interested in the truth and genuinely uninterested in being maneuvered by anyone, regardless of their connections. A contract signed on behalf of a minor by a dying woman who is misled about the terms is precisely the kind of case that will produce in him the kind of focused attention that men like Gru generally prefer to avoid. Then we go to Hatcher's Creek before Gru files the contract with the court, Cole said. Once it is formally registered, a challenge becomes a longer and more complicated matter. We get to Hale first. Abigail had been listening with her hands folded on the table. I can give a clear account, in plain order, whatever he needs. Then that is what we do, Silas said. Cole looked at the letter on the table. He looked at the fire. He made the calculation of time and risk, and available options with the methodical attention he gave to any problem that had real consequences. Then Abigail's voice from across the table, quiet and entirely steady. I'm not asking you to fight my battles, Cole. A pause exactly as long as it needed to be. But I wouldn't say no if you wanted to. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Beside her, Silas appeared to be examining the letter with an extraordinary concentration that deceived neither of them. Get some sleep, Cole said. We ride before first light. The map was old, drawn on heavy paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times over the years that the creases had softened to the texture of worn cloth, the fibers at the fold lines furred and gentle from so much handling. Cole had made it himself during his first years on the mountain, adding to it with each season, marking the condition of the trail crossings and the behavior of the creek in different stages of the winter. Silas had added corrections in a different hand, and they had argued pleasantly over several of those corrections and reached compromises that were noted in a third notation that no one else would have been able to interpret. Cole spread it on the table the night before they planned to ride, and the three of them bent over it in the firelight and talked through the route with the unhurried seriousness of people who understand that poor planning has permanent consequences and who have the experience to know which details are merely inconvenient and which ones are genuinely dangerous. The main trail to Hatcher's Creek dropped off the east face of the mountain and ran through 2 passes before reaching the valley floor. 2 days under good conditions, and the route that Gru's men knew and had been traveling. Silas traced the secondary track with one extended finger, a longer route that drops south through the creek drainage before rejoining the valley road well above Hatcher's Creek. Half a day longer in good conditions, possibly more in the current snow, and considerably less exposed. More importantly, it was the route that would not be anticipated. The secondary track crosses the upper creek twice, Cole said. The ice was carrying weight when I last crossed it 2 weeks ago, Silas said. It will hold horses if we approach the second crossing at the correct angle and take it without rushing. The approach on the south bank is steep, but there is a line down it that is manageable. If they are watching the cabin and they see us leave, how much time before they can determine which route we have taken? An hour, at minimum. The secondary track drops quickly in the first mile and moves into the drainage where the sight lines from the ridge are limited. Get into that drainage early and we hold the advantage for as long as we can move faster in the lower ground than they can on the open ridge above. We can, Cole said, without any dramatizing of the statement. It was an assessment, not a declaration, and it was based on 20 years of knowing that mountain, in conditions that most people would not have traveled in at all. He folded the map along its old creases and placed it inside his coat pocket. The remaining evening hours he spent in the methodical preparation that was his clearest way of thinking through a problem. He worked in the barn by lantern light, the cold air carrying the smell of horses and dry hay and the particular quality of cold air in a well-tended stable. He went through each horse carefully, pressing his thumb around every nail of every shoe, testing the fit of the heels, running his hands along each leg to check for heat or swelling that might indicate a developing problem he needed to know about before the morning. He packed saddlebags with 3 days of dried provisions, a second bedroll for Abigail. His full allocation of ammunition counted twice, and Gru's letter wrapped in oilcloth and placed at the bottom of his own bag, where it would ride safely through whatever the day required. He cleaned his rifle with the slow, complete attention he always gave that particular task, not because the rifle needed it after so recent a previous cleaning, but because the work helped him think, and because a clean rifle in the morning was something he could be certain of. He had carried it for 12 years. He knew it the way a working man knows his best tool, its particular pull and its balance, and the small adjustments of aim that years had made automatic. It was not a remarkable rifle by any outside measure. It was simply a tool he trusted completely. Silas had settled into the chair by the fire, his chin dropping toward his chest, his breathing deepening into the heavy rhythm of a man who has ridden hard in cold weather and is taking what rest the situation offers without ceremony. Cole went inside, and Abigail was already in her coat and the wool hat he had given her, standing near the door with the readiness of a person who has been waiting and is prepared to go. They went outside together. The cold at that hour was dense and absolute, the mountain's full temperature radiating up from the snow and pressing down from the clear sky simultaneously, the kind of cold that does not relent and does not pretend to. The lantern Cole carried made a small circle of warm-colored light in the surrounding blue dark. The stars where the sky was clear above the ridge were hard and close. They stood together beside the barn while he made the final checks on the saddle leather, running both hands along each strap and buckle, and for a time neither of them spoke. The silence between them had the quality it had developed over the weeks of winter, comfortable and inhabited and requiring nothing from either of them. Then he said, without quite planning to, "Before you came, I had stopped expecting anything from the future." She gave the statement the room it needed before she answered. That was a quality in her he had come to count on. What does that mean exactly? Not a challenge, but a genuine question from someone who wants to understand something with precision. He thought about how to say it accurately, the way he thought about all things that were worth saying accurately. I had built a good life here. I still believe that. But there is a difference between a life that is good and a life that is going somewhere. I had the first one. At some point, I stopped imagining the second. The mountain was enough, because I had decided that it would be, and somewhere along the way, that deciding had quietly become the same thing as accepting that nothing else was possible for me. I did not notice the change when it happened. I only see it now because something has changed back. Their breath rose and dissolved in the cold air at the same height and the same pace. And now, she said, now I can picture it again, the other version, the one that is going somewhere. She turned toward him in the lantern light, and what was in her expression was simple and present and entirely certain, with none of the performance that uncertainty produces. "It doesn't have to be just enough anymore," she said. Cole held those words in the way he held the things that were worth keeping. He did not add to them, because they were already complete and did not require anything from him except to be heard. They went back inside. He slept 4 hours in the light way of a man who needs to be ready, with his hand near the rifle and his mind quiet, and woke before the first hint of gray in the sky. They rode out in the full dark before dawn, 3 horses moving single file through the heavy timber. Cole led, Abigail close behind him, Silas at the rear with the easy, practiced seat of a man who has spent as many decades on horseback as on foot. They moved in the natural quiet of experienced travelers who know that cold air carries sound farther than most people remember, and who had no reason to add to what the mountain was already saying. The mountain in the early dark was a thing of such severe and unhurried beauty that Cole, even now with the full weight of the day ahead pressing on him, felt it as he always felt it, in the chest, without words. The snow holding the last of the night's blue dark before the light arrived. The absolute stillness of the tree line. The clean, soft percussion of the horses moving through the crust. The silence between those sounds, so complete it seemed to contain something rather than simply to represent absence. Mid-morning, pushing through the upper section of the drainage, where the timber briefly thinned, Cole caught movement on the ridge above with his peripheral vision. 2 riders paralleling their route at a distance and maintaining their pace without closing. He redirected with small, gradual adjustments of heading that would appear from above as ordinary trail following. He heard Silas adjust behind him. "Don't look up," Cole said quietly. 2 riders on the ridge above. We go lower into the drainage. They pushed through the afternoon. The riders fell behind as the drainage deepened, and their sightlines to the secondary track became limited. By the time they climbed out onto the valley road, Hatcher's Creek was visible far below, smoke rising in thin straight lines from a dozen chimneys into the still cold air. A rifle shot cracked off the ridge behind them. A single clean report carried flat and sharp through the cold. Cole's hand tightened on the reins once. He set his face toward the valley and rode. The shot had been a ranging call, not an aimed one. Cole understood the difference and used the knowledge. The narrow pass in the secondary track was half a mile back, a tight cut between 2 angled faces of rock, where the drainage had forced the trail into a channel barely wide enough for a horse and rider. He had noted it on the way through and filed it away with the part of his mind that was always, on some level, reading the terrain for exactly this kind of use. He pulled up and turned in the saddle. "Silas, take Abigail down the valley road. Don't stop until you're at the judge's door." Silas read the situation without needing it explained. He was already moving up beside Abigail, positioning his horse to guide hers. Abigail did not move immediately. She looked at Cole with an expression he would have liked more time to examine, something direct and serious and entirely without panic. "I don't want to leave you here," she said, not pleading. Stating, "I know," Cole said. "Go with Silas. Getting you to that judge is the whole point of this. Everything else is secondary." A moment, her eyes on his. Her hand reached out briefly and settled on his forearm, one firm, intentional pressure, and then she let go. "Don't do anything unnecessary," she said. "I don't make a habit of it." Silas led her horse around, and they moved off down the valley road at a pace that was urgent without being disorderly. Cole watched until they rounded the first bend and disappeared behind the timber. Then he turned his horse and rode back up the track toward the narrow pass. He dismounted at the entrance to the cut, tied the horse in the timber to the left, and moved on foot into the rocks. The pass was perhaps 40 yards long, and he positioned himself at the midpoint, where a shelf of rock allowed him to look back down the approach without being easily visible from below. He did not have to wait long. 2 riders came up the track at a canter, sure of their speed, clearly expecting to intercept at the pass. They were heavy-set men, experienced riders, and they moved with a coordinated confidence that told Cole they had done this kind of work before. The one in front wore a dark coat. The second had a rifle across his saddle bow. Cole let them come until they were close enough to hear him without shouting. He fired once, above and between them, into the rock face. The crack of it in the pass was considerably louder than a shot in open country, and both horses shied hard. "That's as far as you go today," Cole said, from the rocks, at a volume that carried clearly without effort. The riders controlled their horses. The man in front looked toward Cole's position with the calculated assessment of someone measuring a problem. "We have legal business with the woman, a contract properly witnessed. You're obstructing lawful business. The woman is on her way to a territorial judge," Cole said. "You're welcome to make your case there. That's the appropriate place for it." The man in front exchanged a look with the one behind him. They were calculating, Cole could see that, measuring the odds of the pass against the cover he had, and the fact that he had already demonstrated he could put a shot exactly where he intended it. "Step aside, and this doesn't become something more serious," the man said. I'll take my chances, Cole said pleasantly. The second man made a decision and spurred his horse forward. Cole did not hesitate. He put a shot in front of the horse's left foreleg, not harming the animal, but placing it close enough that the horse refused the pass and went sideways and came down on one knee in the snow. The rider went over its neck and landed hard in the drift to the right of the trail. The horse scrambled up, shaken, but sound. The rider rose from the snow more slowly, checking himself with the irritated thoroughness of a man cataloging injury. Cole waited. The lead rider looked from his partner in the snow to the rocks where Cole was positioned, and then he looked at the valley below and did the arithmetic. He pulled his horse around. "This isn't finished," he called back over his shoulder. "Go make your case to the judge," Cole answered. "That's where it gets finished." He watched them go. The lead rider waited for his partner to collect his horse, and then they moved back down the track, not at a run, but steadily, putting distance between themselves and the pass. Cole stayed in the rocks until they were out of sight. Then he climbed down, untied his horse, and turned its head toward Hatcher's Creek. Below him, somewhere on the valley road, Silas and Abigail were riding toward the same destination. He did not push the horse harder than the terrain allowed. He had done what needed doing. The rest was in the hands of a territorial judge, and the plain truth of what had happened to a woman left in the snow. He trusted that the truth would be enough. Cole arrived in Hatcher's Creek with the last of the afternoon light, sitting flat and orange on the snow of the main street. It was a small town, a dozen buildings on each side of a wide frozen road, smoke from every chimney, horses at the rail in front of the general store. He had been here perhaps 4 times in as many years, and it looked no different from any of those visits. The same weathered storefronts, the same arrangement of the mountain visible above the eastern roofline. He found the territorial judge's office by the lamp burning in its front window, a modest building set back slightly from the main street with a painted board above the door. Silas's horse and Abigail's were already tied at the rail. He went inside. The office was a single room with a writing desk, 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and a shelf of ledgers that occupied the entire north wall. Judge Orrin Hale sat behind the desk, a heavy-set man in his middle 60s, with a full gray beard and the kind of face that does not arrange itself for the convenience of visitors. He looked up when Cole came in with an expression that indicated he was not surprised by the addition of another party to the proceedings. Abigail was seated in one of the chairs. Silas stood to her right. Both of them looked at Cole when he entered with the particular relief of people who had been fairly certain something would turn out all right, but had not been entirely certain. "Mr. Turner," the judge said, in the tone of a man who has been told who is coming, "I understand you had some difficulty on the upper track." "Resolved," Cole said. He took off his hat. Judge Hale looked at him for a moment with the assessing quality of a man who has spent decades separating the honest from the dishonest in difficult situations. Then he returned his attention to the papers on his desk. Abigail had already given her account before Cole arrived. The judge had Gru's letter, the original copy that Cole had carried in oilcloth in his saddlebag. He had apparently spent some time examining the letter while waiting, and had formed preliminary views that he expressed without particular sentiment. "I have 2 problems with this contract as presented," the judge said, addressing the room in general. "The first is that the signatory, one Ruth Reed, appears to have signed on behalf of her daughter, but the contract does not contain the daughter's own signature, and under territorial law, a labor contract for a person above the age of 16 requires that person's own agreement, documented." He paused. "The second problem is that Miss Reed has testified credibly that the terms as represented to her mother differ materially from the terms written in the document, and that her mother was in a state of serious illness at the time of signing, and in no condition to evaluate what she was agreeing to." He looked at Abigail over the top of his papers. "You understand that what you've told me constitutes a formal deposition, and that I am recording it in the official register." "I understand," Abigail said. Her voice was steady. "And you have no desire to return to the employ of Harlan Gru, or to honor any obligations arising from this document?" "None." Judge Hale opened the large ledger on his desk, the official record of his court, and wrote in it with the deliberate hand of a man who understands that what goes into a ledger carries weight that ordinary speech does not. He wrote for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he signed his name and dated it and blotted the ink. "The contract is unenforceable," he said. "I am issuing formal notice to Harlan Grew that any further attempt to compel Miss Reed's return or to enforce this or any similar document against her will be considered harassment under territorial statutes and will be prosecuted." Accordingly, he looked up. "I'll have my clerk deliver that notice tomorrow morning." He closed the ledger. Abigail sat with the certified copy of the judge's ruling in both hands, the paper slightly unsteady in her still healing fingers. Cole watched her from across the room. She did not look triumphant. She looked as though something that had been pressing on her for a very long time had simply lifted, and the feeling of the lifting was what she was experiencing, which is its own quiet kind of emotion. She looked up and found him watching, and what moved between them across that room in that moment required no translation. They ate that evening at the only inn in Hatcher's Creek, a decent meal served at a table by a window that looked out onto the dark street. Silas had 2 cups of something warmer than coffee and was in fine spirits, and the dinner carried a particular quality of earned ease that Cole did not have a precise word for, but recognized when he was in it. Silas raised his cup at the end of the meal. "To the mountain," he said, which apparently has better judgment than any of us gave it credit for. Cole raised his own cup. Abigail laughed, a full and unguarded laugh, and the sound of it in that warm room stayed with Cole in the way that certain sounds do when a person understands that they are in the middle of a moment they will not forget. Afterward, Cole walked with Abigail out into the cold street while Silas settled the account inside. The town was quiet by this hour, a few lights in windows, the horses drowsing at the rails, the sky above the valley full of stars so numerous and so clear that they seemed only slightly out of reach. He stopped walking. He turned to her. He was aware, in the particular way that serious moments announce themselves, that this was the moment, and he was aware also that he was nervous, which was not a familiar condition, and which he did not try to conceal. He said, "I'd like you to come back to the mountain with me, and to stay, and to build something there together that's worth the building." He paused. "I'm not a man who says more than he means, and I mean all of that." She looked at him for a long moment in the cold starlight. Then she said yes. It was a simple word. It was the most important word Cole Turner had heard in his 41 years on this earth. He held it in his chest the way the mountains hold snow through winter, carefully and without waste, knowing that in time it will become the water that everything else grows from. Spring arrived on that mountain the way it always had, unhurried and without announcement, a gradual softening of things rather than any single decisive change. The snow on the upper ridges was the last to go, holding through April and into May in the shadowed north-facing gullies, where the sun reached only in the long evenings. But the lower slopes opened early, the melt following the south-facing draws down to the creek, and the willows along the water showed color before the last of the hard frost was out of the ground. The pines shed their loads and stood upright again after months of bearing the weight, and the air that had been still and crystalline through the long winter began to move again, carrying the smell of wet earth and new growth, and the particular promise that spring on a mountain carries, which is the promise not just of warmth, but of time to do the things that winter put aside. The cabin looked the same from the outside. From the inside, it was unmistakably different. 2 cups on the table every morning, her things on the shelf beside his books, the locket on the windowsill where the morning light found it first. A kitchen garden begun against the south wall of the cabin, the beds turned and planted with the organized intention of someone who had been thinking about what to grow since February. Small differences, the kind that accumulate quietly, and then one day you look around and realize the place is different in a way that has nothing to do with construction. Cole had not renovated the cabin. He had not added rooms or rearranged the furniture in any significant way. What had changed was the quality of the space, the way a room changes when it is genuinely lived in by more than one person, when it contains two separate histories and one shared present. Their mornings were simple. Coffee while the light came in across the ridge. The day's work divided between them without much discussion, because they had learned each other's rhythms well enough that division happened naturally, each of them gravitating toward the tasks that suited them. Abigail had a gift for the kitchen garden and for the management of provisions that Cole had always done adequately, but that she did with a quiet precision that resulted in better outcomes all around. Cole handled the trap lines and the livestock and the heavier maintenance, and in the evenings they sat at the table together and talked, or read, or simply occupied the same room in the comfortable silence of people who have no need to fill it. Silas came by more often than he used to. He appeared one morning in late May with news from Hatcher's Creek, arriving on horseback now that the lower trail was clear, in considerably better spirits than his winter visits typically produced. He tied his horse and came in and accepted coffee and sat down with the ease of a man fully at home in the place. Harlan Grew had moved his wagon operation south and out of the territory. Judge Hale's formal notice had apparently been received and understood, and those who knew Grew in Hatcher's Creek reported that he had departed with neither drama nor ceremony, which was either the behavior of a man who had accepted the ruling or the behavior of a man who had decided the situation was not worth the trouble, and in either case, the practical result was the same. The matter was closed. Cole absorbed this information with a nod and refilled Silas's coffee without comment. Abigail, at the garden through the window, straightened and looked toward the cabin when she saw Silas's horse, and came inside dusting her hands on her apron. Silas told her himself. She listened, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Good." Just that one word, but she said it the way a person says a word that ends a chapter, with a finality that has nothing angry in it. She had written to her cousin Martha the previous week. Cole had read the letter before she sealed it, as she had asked him to. It did not explain everything. Some things are too large and too personal to fit in a letter to someone you have not seen in years. But it said what needed saying, that she had found a home, and that it was not what she had originally been traveling toward, and that she was well, and that she hoped Martha was well, and that she would write again when spring was properly established. Cole had read it and handed it back to her. "Good," he had said, the same word she had just used about Grew, and it meant the same thing. This is settled, and the settling is right. The three of them sat together that spring morning, with their coffee and the window open to the mountain air, and talked about nothing of great consequence, which was its own kind of gift. Silas told a story about a disagreement he'd had with a mule driver in Hatcher's Creek over the price of cornmeal, rendered in his characteristic deadpan that had both Cole and Abigail laughing before the story was half finished. After Silas left, Cole walked up to the high ridge in the late afternoon, the one where the whole of the valley was visible below and the upper snowfields were visible above, the place he'd been going to think his whole time on this mountain. Abigail came with him. They stood at the top of the ridge and looked out over the valley below, green now and wide and impossibly present after the long months of white. The creek was running fast with snowmelt, a silver thread moving through the new green of the willows. The mountains to the north still carried their winter coats on the high peaks. The sky was the particular blue of a late spring afternoon, in high country, deep and clear and without limit. Cole did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the view did not already say better. He took her hand. She stood beside him with her face lifted toward the mountain light, the locket at her throat, the wind moving her hair. The woman he had pulled from the snow on a frozen ridge on a dark winter morning, who had no home and had said yes before the sun rose, who had brought 2 cups and a kitchen garden, and a laugh he still found new every time he heard it. The mountain held its counsel, as it always had, watching over the lives lived out on its slopes with the patient impersonal grandeur of something very old that has seen everything and judged nothing. Below them, the valley was fully awake in the spring light, and above them the high peaks kept the snow a while longer, unhurried, as though they understood there was no reason to rush toward any particular season, when each one, in its time, offered something worth keeping.